Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz, and this season we will be unpacking real trends, hot topics in the workplace around allyship and inclusion. Our goal is that each week you leave with tangible tools, information, practical strategies that you can take back to allies at your organization. Let's dig in to this week's topic. Hello, listeners. The topic this week is psychological safety. And if you haven't heard that term before or not sure what it means, it kind of means what it sounds like, the ability to feel safe in a mental space at work. And that kind of safety is actually really critical, almost, if not just as important as physical safety. And so for organizations that have focused on physical safety, a natural extension would be to think about psychological safety, because if we don't feel safe speaking up about mistakes, weaknesses, failures, and we can't challenge the status quo without fear of retribution, then we can't have an inclusive work environment. And sadly, studies show that many organizations lack psychological safety. People don't feel safe speaking up about mistakes, weaknesses, failures. And that also is highly correlated with diverse groups. So members of diverse groups often feel less safe speaking up about mistakes, weaknesses, failures, which costs everyone the inability to have an inclusive culture. So just to highlight some research, Boston Consulting Group just did a study, and I'll link to that in the show notes. But they found that more than 4 times that when we want to build psychological safety, retention increases by more than 4 times for women, for employees who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Retention increases 5 times more for folks with disabilities, 6 times more for LGBTQ plus folks, and 2 times for men that aren't even in these groups. So it benefits everyone when we have psychological safety. If you're struggling with retention, especially of diverse groups, work on psychological safety. So a lot of this phenomenon was popularized by Amy C. Edmondson, and she has a new book out, Right Kind of Wrong, where her research, indicates that failure is riskier for historically marginalized groups. People often confuse psychological safety with belonging. But psychological safety is a collective, meaning it has a cultural context. It's not an individual feeling like belonging, which is really a personal feeling. So the group feels psychologically safe or doesn't. And if historically marginalized groups don't feel safe, the entire group lacks that safety. So it's not an individual feeling like belonging, whereas someone can feel that they belong, or someone doesn't feel psychologically safe. We all feel that kind of primal lack of safety for the group. So workplaces rarely have this, and this is how we're wired. Why is that? Why do workplaces struggle with psychological safety? A lot of it has to do with our natural neuroscience, how our brains are wired. When we see a threat, feedback, something that we've done wrong, a mistake, our brain just kind of goes that freeze, flight, or fight mode. And combats this lack of safety, much like we would have a primal predator. But our brains really experience social rejection similar to physical pain. So when our egos threaten, we often deflect blame to avoid the risk of being ostracized by the group. So with that fear, it can be easier to kind of shield ourselves. That vulnerability feels like a risk. And so just getting comfortable modeling this, especially as leaders. So we found that, psychological safety needs a few key ingredients, and courageous communication really requires leaders to be vulnerable, to show up authentically, and to acknowledge that we're all works in progress. No one's perfect. Curiosity can be one of our best tools. So if you're wondering how psychologically safe is my team, I would ask you to kind of rate these behaviors on a scale of 1 to 10 and compare notes anonymously with your group especially psychological safety you suspect might be an issue. But, the degree to which you feel safe speaking up about a challenging issue, you see others sharing dissenting opinions at work, have candid conversations with your manager about these challenges, you admit your mistakes, share failures as a way to learn and grow, embrace different perspectives, openly ask for feedback, see constructive feedback as a part of growth and learning, get constructive feedback from folks on your team, hear reality versus optimism, learn about problems versus progress, focus on divergent thinking versus convergent thinking. How often do you hear, I need help versus, it's all good, right? So that full inventory of questions, if you're curious about psychological safety, check that out. I'll put a link to the full article with the link to the research and the assessment as well. And, if you're feeling like a lot of those behaviors your team is lacking, your organization is lacking, just know you're not alone. And also know that the more you model vulnerability, authenticity, and curiosity, the more people take note around you. And so we can all model the behaviors that we want to see more from other people, especially if you're in a position of influence or power or a leadership position.
Thank you for listening to the Diversity Pivot podcast. My hope is that you walked away with a tangible tool, insight, or information that you can share with other allies on the journey. If you liked this week's episode, please leave us a review. Your feedback means a tremendous amount to us. We'll be back next week with another hot topic.
Thanks for listening.